Hello, I'm Emilio Vargas. Over the past 34 years, my life has been a long journey. From the dusty streets of San Diego to the glass towers of the tech world. People know me as a successful engineer, the golden boy of tech, but that title means little. I was shaped not by glory, but by my childhood in a rickety one-story house where the sound of my father's guitar mingled with the swish of my mother's mop, the simple sounds that nurtured my determination and dreams. And perhaps what truly made me grow wasn't the successes that came later, but the realization that love, no matter how pure, can leave the deepest wounds. I was born in San Diego, California, in a working-class neighborhood where the smell of tacos from street carts blended with the blare of car horns and late-night arguments. My father, Manuel Vargas, was a street musician. He came from Guadalajara, Mexico, with an old guitar and a dream that never came true, to become a famous musician. My mother, Rosa, was a cleaner, leaving before dawn each day to scrub the floors of gleaming downtown offices. They met at a small diner where my mother worked extra hours and my father played for spare change. Their love story, as my father told it, was an unfinished ballad, but enough to keep us together. As the eldest son, I carried the weight of my family's expectations. From a young age, I knew failure wasn't an option. Every time I saw my mother come home with hands swollen and red from cleaning chemicals, or my father quietly polishing his guitar with distant eyes, I vowed to make them proud. Our neighborhood wasn't a place for dreamers. Kids my age either dropped out to work early or fell into gangs. But I had my parents who, despite their poverty, believed education was the only ticket out of that vicious cycle. "Study, Emilio," my mother would say, her voice trembling with exhaustion, "so no one can look down on you." My childhood had no summer vacations or field trips. After school, I delivered newspapers, washed cars, and waited tables at a nearby diner. Every penny I earned went toward used books and saving for my college dream. Some days I had to choose between a decent meal and a new programming book. But I never felt deprived. Each line of code was a small step away from the poverty my parents endured. That effort paid off. I earned a partial scholarship to California State University, working part-time in the tech lab, where I spent nights sleeping among circuit boards and components. I graduated at the top of my class with a degree in computer engineering. On graduation day, my parents sat in the back row of the auditorium, my mother in her simplest dress, my father in a borrowed suit from a neighbor. When my name was called, my mother wiped away tears and my father clapped until his hands were red. In that moment, I knew I'd done it. I'd given them the pride they'd never had in their lives. Then I was hired by Pacific Systems Group, a major tech company in Los Angeles. The job was stable, well paid, and I began dreaming of a brighter future for my family. But as my father once said, fate always has a way of playing tricks on us. My story truly changed when I joined a volunteer project called HopeWorks, where I met Kennedy Hayes. Kennedy, 30, was a breath of fresh air in my life. She was the only daughter of the Hayes family, owners of Hayes Construction Group, a construction empire in Seattle. I first met her while presenting a free data management system for nonprofits. Kennedy sat in the front row, her golden hair glowing under the auditorium lights, her sharp blue eyes warm rather than cold. She asked questions, not to show off, but ones that challenged me to think deeply. After the presentation, she shook my hand, her smile as radiant as summer sunlight. "You surprised me, Emilio," she said, and my heart beat faster than usual. We started talking, first about work, then over long coffee sessions and late-night texts about dreams and life. Kennedy wasn't what I expected from a wealthy heiress. She was genuine, intelligent, and had a burning passion for changing the world. She spoke of the pressures of her family, how her father, Donovan Hayes, wanted her to be a perfect version of him, a cold, decisive leader. "But that's not me," she once said, her eyes sparking with defiance. "I want to live my way." Our love grew quietly, like a secret only we shared. Over 2 years, Kennedy and I became inseparable. The day she brought me to meet her family was when I realized her world was entirely different from mine. The Hayes family lived in a lakeside mansion in Laurelhurst, a place where every brick seemed to exude privilege. Donovan Hayes, her father, was a tall man with salt and pepper hair and eyes sharp as a blade. He shook my hand with a grip so tight it felt like a test of my endurance. Clarissa, Kennedy's mother, was a renowned interior designer, her smile polite but icy. That dinner felt more like an interrogation than an introduction. Donovan asked about my work, each question laced with scrutiny, as if weighing whether I was worthy of his daughter. Clarissa said little, offering only smiles and nods, but I sensed disdain in her eyes. "Emilio, what do you do at Pacific Systems?" Donovan asked, his voice deep and commanding. "I'm a software engineer, sir. Currently, I'm developing data management systems for large projects." He nodded, but his lips curled into a faint smile. "Engineer? That's good. But do you know construction? That's where real money is made?" I forced a smile, trying to stay composed. Kennedy squeezed my hand under the table as if to say she was there with me. But the feeling of being out of place clung to me like an unwelcome guest. After that night, Kennedy told me her parents opposed our relationship. Donovan bluntly called me beneath her station. Clarissa was more diplomatic, saying she only wanted stability for her daughter. But Kennedy, with the resolve I always admired, declared she'd marry me no matter what. I thought our love was strong enough to overcome anything. But a week before the wedding, Donovan summoned me to his office. He slid a thick stack of papers across the desk, his voice cold. "Sign this, Emilio. It's a prenuptial agreement. All of Kennedy's assets will remain separate from you. If you divorce, you get nothing from the Hayes family." I looked into his eyes, feeling my pride torn apart. But for Kennedy, for our love, I picked up the pen and signed. I didn't want her to have to choose between me and her family. Yet as I put the pen down, I felt an invisible crack begin to spread in my heart. A week later, on my 29th birthday, our wedding took place at the Lake Washington Country Club, a place so lavish I felt out of place amid the chandeliers and expensive wine glasses. The media called it a modern fairy tale, the immigrant engineer and the heiress. But behind the glamour, I saw my parents seated at the back table, far from the honored guests. Donovan looked at them with a sneer, his voice loud enough for others to hear. "I suppose they've never been to a place like this. Hope they're not overwhelmed by all the cutlery." Clarissa set down her wine glass, offering a cold smile and tilting her head. "I think they're trying their best to fit in. It's charming in a rustic way." A few guests chuckled softly, the clink of glasses sounding harsh in the opulent space. I heard every word, every laugh, like needles piercing my heart. "Quite the contrast, isn't it?" one guest said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look at his parents, like they just stepped out of a slum." My face burned, my heart heavy. My father still tried to smile, striking up conversation with a waiter to ease his discomfort. My mother held his hand, her eyes a mix of pride and slight embarrassment. In that dazzling setting, I suddenly felt smaller than ever. The brilliant lights couldn't hide the shame and humiliation rising within me. And in that moment, I understood. Even on my own wedding day, they wouldn't respect my parents. It was the first crack, small but deep, foreshadowing everything that would come later. After the lavish wedding, Kennedy and I moved to Queen Anne, an affluent Seattle neighborhood where modern homes stood side by side like symbols of power and wealth. Our house was a stunning architectural marvel, with glass walls overlooking Puget Sound and luxurious interiors designed by Kennedy's mother, Clarissa. But one detail I could never forget was the small print on the deed. Hayes Construction Group. This house wasn't mine, wasn't ours. It belonged to her family, and I was merely a guest allowed to stay. Life in high society was like a play I was forced to memorize. Business dinners, charity galas, black tie events where everyone wore expensive suits and gowns, they were all stages where I had to perform. I learned how to shake hands properly, smile through probing questions, and respond without betraying my discomfort. But standing beside Kennedy, I saw the scrutiny in people's eyes. "The immigrant engineer," they whispered behind my back, their tone a mix of curiosity and mockery. "What did he do to win her? It sure wasn't money." I tried not to let those words get to me, but every time someone mentioned Kennedy's family or the Hayes Golden Girl, I felt like a faint shadow next to her. Kennedy always held my hand, introducing me as her talented husband with a smile. But the looks from others told a bitter truth. They didn't see me, Emilio Vargas. They only saw the lucky man who married Kennedy Hayes. I swallowed the hurt, stayed silent, and focused on my dream. For years, I'd nurtured the idea of starting a tech marketing company, a platform to help small businesses reach customers smarter and more efficiently. That idea burned in me, a fire keeping me grounded amid the stifling days in Queen Anne. 2 years after the wedding, I convinced Kennedy to co-found Vargas and Hayes Innovations. She agreed instantly, her eyes lighting up as I shared my vision. "I believe in you, Emilio," she said. And in that moment, I felt our love was still intact, despite the pressures. But launching the company required capital, a lot of it. And that's when the Hayes family stepped in. Donovan Hayes, Kennedy's father, agreed to invest. He sat across from me in his office, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "You've got a good idea, Emilio. But ideas aren't enough. You need money, and I have money." I nodded, knowing this was my only shot at making my dream real. But as I signed the contract, I couldn't ignore his gaze, the look of a man holding all the power, with me as just a pawn on his board. Vargas and Hayes Innovations was born, with me leading operations and product development, while Kennedy handled finances and administration. The company grew quickly. My products, data analytics platforms, and digital marketing strategies earned high praise from clients. The media took notice, calling us the perfect blend of brains and wealth. On social media, images of Kennedy and me were everywhere, from interviews to articles celebrating our modern marriage. But behind the glamour, the truth was far different. Within the company, I began to see my real place. Everyone implicitly understood that Kennedy represented the Hayes family. She controlled financial decisions, signed off on major contracts, and took the lead in key negotiations. I, despite being the founder and CEO, was seen as the technical lead, a polite way of saying I was just a senior employee, nothing more. My achievements, the sleepless nights perfecting products, were increasingly branded as thanks to the Hayes family's capital and connections. What hurt most was the legal paperwork. I held only 30% of the company's shares. The rest belonged to Kennedy as the primary investor. When I asked her about it, she smiled and said, "Don't worry, Emilio. It's just paperwork. We're a team." But in her voice, I detected a distance I hadn't felt before. The birth of our son, Beau, was a ray of light in the darkness. The day he was born, I sat by Kennedy's bedside, holding her hand and gazing into Beau's clear eyes. In that moment, I thought everything would be okay. Beau was a bridge between Kennedy and me, a reason to keep trying. I wanted him to grow up in a happy family, not in the shadows of prejudice and power. But the gap between Kennedy and me didn't close. She grew busier with meetings I wasn't invited to, phone calls she answered in hushed tones. I tried to convince myself it was just work stress, that she still loved me as before. Each night after Beau was asleep, I sat in my study, looking out at Puget Sound through the glass walls. This house, this company, this life, it was the dream I'd once craved. But now I felt like a stranger in the world I'd built. The whispers at parties, Donovan's disdainful looks, Kennedy's growing distance. They were like drops overflowing a glass. I tried to keep the peace, believing that if I worked harder, my results would prove my worth. I dove into work, developing new products, securing contracts, and turning Vargas and Hayes Innovations into a major name. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the label of owing it all to the Hayes family. One evening, as I worked late at the office, Kennedy walked in. She wore an elegant business dress, but her eyes were colder than usual. "We need to talk about the new financial plan," she said, her voice flat. I nodded, waiting. But instead of discussing, she handed me a report and said, "Just look it over. It's already been decided." I scanned the report and saw a major investment approved without my knowledge. Kennedy, why didn't you discuss this with me first? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She smiled, but it lacked the warmth it once had. Emilio, you focus on the products. Let me handle this. Her words cut like a knife. I realized that in this company, in this marriage, I didn't truly have a voice. And in that moment, I began to suspect that beneath the calm surface, a storm was quietly brewing. 3 years after Vargas and Hayes Innovations was founded, our company had risen to become a major player in the Northwest. From a small idea in my head, we were now a leading tech marketing firm, securing contracts with major corporations in Seattle and Portland. And I, Emilio Vargas, the kid from the San Diego slums, became a face sought after by tech magazines. The immigrant engineer who made it, they called me, with lengthy articles accompanied by photos of me standing in a sleek office, gazing confidently at the camera. But every time I read those articles, I felt a strange emptiness. This success, though dazzling, wasn't entirely mine. Kennedy and I still appeared together in photos, at events, and interviews. But when the spotlight faded, I sensed a change in her. She was no longer the woman who sat with me in small coffee shops, passionately talking about dreams and the future. She shared less about work, often absent with excuses like busy with meetings or meeting a partner. Closed-door meetings with the accounting department and her father, Donovan Hayes, became more frequent, and I wasn't invited. At first, I told myself it was just the pressure of a growing company. Kennedy was always skilled with numbers. But then major decisions started being made without my input. I'd learn about them through late emails or reports left on my desk as a formality. We need to expand the Portland branch, one email read, signed by Kennedy. Approved by the board. What board? I was the CEO, but it seemed no one needed my opinion. One late evening, when the office was empty, I sat down to review the accounting system. Bo was asleep at home with the nanny, and Kennedy had left that afternoon to meet an investor. The glow of the computer screen lit my face as numbers danced before my eyes. I wasn't a financial expert, but I was sharp enough to spot something wrong. A series of irregular transactions appeared. Large sums transferred through multiple accounts, labeled as project expenses but tied to no specific contracts. Some listed projects didn't even exist in our system. I frowned, a chill running down my spine. I clicked on a transaction for details, but a message popped up. Access restricted. Please contact the financial manager. The financial manager was Kennedy. I tried logging in with my admin account, but my access had been limited. This had never happened before. My heart raced, not from anger, but from a growing sense of dread. The next day, I confronted Kennedy in her office. She was sitting at her computer, her blonde hair tied up, her eyes focused on the screen. Kennedy, I said, keeping my voice calm. I looked at the accounting system last night. There were some strange transactions. Can you explain? She looked up, a flicker of tension in her eyes before they softened. Those are internal operations, Emilio, she said coolly. You don't need to worry. Everything's under control. But I'm the CEO, I replied, unable to hide my frustration. I need to know what's happening in my company. Kennedy smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Our company, love, she emphasized our, but it sounded like a reminder that I wasn't truly in charge. You focus on the products. I'll handle the rest. Her words hit like a slap. I stood there, staring as she turned back to her screen, dismissing the conversation. As I left her office, a deep suspicion took root in my mind. This company, my dream, might be a front for something bigger, darker, and the name Hayes, once the capital behind my dream, now loomed like a threatening shadow. From that day, I acted in silence. I couldn't confront them directly. Not yet. If Kennedy and her family were involved in something shady, I needed proof. I began backing up every piece of data I could access. Bank statements, internal emails, contracts, and those suspicious transactions. I worked at night when the office was empty, careful not to be detected. Every sound of footsteps made me jump, my heart pounding like a thief in my own company. I knew I had to go further. With my engineering expertise, I installed hidden monitoring software on the accounting department's computers in Kennedy's. I wasn't proud of it. Spying on my wife felt like betraying myself. But I had no choice. The software logged every email, login, and private exchange I wasn't supposed to see. Everything was backed up to a secure hard drive and an encrypted cloud only I could access. Each night I sifted through the data, line by line, word by word, like a detective searching for clues in a case I didn't want to believe was real. Every time I saw Kennedy playing with Beau, I tried to find the woman I once loved. She still laughed, still gentle with our son, but an invisible wall stood between us. I wanted to believe she was unaware of the shady transactions, that her father was manipulating her. But deep down, I feared the truth was worse. The days that followed were spent like a hunter in the shadows, treading carefully with every step. The monitoring software I'd installed on Kennedy's and the accounting department's computers began yielding results. Each night, as the office fell silent, I opened the encrypted hard drive, sifting through lines of data, emails, and logs. I didn't want to believe what I was doing, spying on my wife, the woman I once loved more than myself. But every time I looked at Beau's smile, I reminded myself I wasn't doing this out of hatred. I was doing it for the truth, for my son, and for the self-respect my parents had taught me to cherish. Then one late night, with rain pattering against the office window, I found something that made my heart stop. A chain of emails between Kennedy, her father, Donovan Hayes, and a lawyer named Robert Caldwell. My fingers trembled as I clicked on the first email. The subject line was simple: internal restructuring. But the contents were anything but. They discussed transferring full ownership of Vargas and Hayes Innovations to Kennedy, citing structural adjustments to optimize profits. I read it over and over, each word stabbing into my chest. This company was my dream, my sweat and blood, but now it was being stolen by the woman I called my wife. I scrolled through the other emails, each revealing another piece of a larger conspiracy. One from Donovan read, "We need to ensure Emilio has no control. He's talented, but he can't interfere with the plan." Another from Caldwell suggested, "We can fabricate evidence of Emilio's tax fraud and embezzlement of investment funds. This will remove him from the company and ensure no one suspects." My blood rushed to my head, my breathing heavy. They didn't just want to take the company. They wanted to ruin me, to frame me as a criminal to cover their own crimes. The shock left me numb. I sat staring at the screen, feeling as if the world had collapsed. All my work, the sleepless nights coding, the days spent pitching to clients, the dreams I'd shared with Kennedy, it was all just a tool in the hands of the Hayes family. I was a pawn they'd used to build their empire, ready to discard when I was no longer useful. For nights on end, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Kennedy's cold gaze, heard Donovan's voice calling me beneath her station. I wanted to confront her, to shout that I knew everything. But I held back. Acting rashly would play into their trap. They wanted me to lose my composure, to make a mistake they could use against me. I couldn't let that happen. Instead of confronting them head-on, I chose to fight back in silence. I began organizing the evidence meticulously, like an archaeologist uncovering a fragile treasure. Every email, bank statement, and suspicious transaction was cataloged by date and sender, encrypted on my hard drive and private cloud. I knew one small slip could erase everything I'd built, and my honor, the value my parents taught me to prize above money, would be forever tarnished. I reached out to Carlos, an old college friend now working as an auditor in San Diego. I met him at a small coffee shop far from Seattle to ensure no one recognized me. "Carlos," I said quietly, "I need you to look at something. But no one can know, not even Kennedy." He looked at me, concern in his eyes but asking no questions. I handed him a USB with bank statements and financial reports, and he promised to analyze them thoroughly. "Stay calm, Emilio," he said. If something's off, I'll find it. Next, I contacted Maria, an immigration lawyer in Los Angeles I'd met during my volunteer work. She wasn't just skilled in law, but knew how to protect people like me, immigrants always living cautiously. Through a secure channel I'd set up, I sent her a portion of the evidence and asked for advice on legitimizing it for court if needed. "Emilio, you're playing a dangerous game," Maria warned over an encrypted call. "But if you're right, the Hayes family won't get away." She guided me on authenticating digital evidence, from timestamps to access logs, to ensure legal validity. All communication with Carlos and Maria happened through secure channels. I avoided my personal email and phone, knowing the Hayes family had the resources to monitor me. Every move was calculated, like walking a tightrope, aware that one misstep could bring my world crashing down. I didn't tell anyone, not even my mother. Her warm heart and simple faith couldn't bear knowing I was fighting my own wife. I wanted to protect her as she and my father had protected me through the hardest years. In those long, lonely nights, I sat in my office, moonlight streaming through the glass, illuminating the data on my screen. I thought of Beau, his smile when I held him. I thought of my father, who taught me that honesty was the one thing no one could take. And I thought of Kennedy, the woman I once loved, now a question mark in my heart. I didn't know how deeply she was involved or if she was just her father's puppet. But whatever the truth, I knew our marriage was dead. Love, no matter how beautiful it once was, couldn't survive when trust was gone. The months that followed were spent like a shadow, quietly gathering evidence, preparing for a battle I knew was coming. But nothing could have prepared me for the deepest pain of my life. One morning, as I was checking emails in the office, my phone rang. My mother's voice, frail and trembling, came through. "Emilio, come home now. Your father, he didn't make it." I don't remember how I left the office or drove to San Diego. Everything was a blur. My father, the man with the worn guitar and warm smile, was gone from a stroke. He was my anchor through the toughest years, the one who always said, "Honesty will keep you standing even when the world turns its back on you." Now he was gone, and I felt like a part of me had died with him. The day of the funeral, San Diego's sky was gray, as if the world mourned with us. I stood outside the church, greeting mourners, trying to stay strong for my mother. The ceremony was simple, like the way my father lived. Only my mother, a few close relatives, and some friends came to say goodbye. I stood by the coffin, looking at my father's face, peaceful as if asleep. My mother held my hand, her eyes red but forcing a smile. "Your father was proud of you, Emilio," she said, her voice breaking. "He always was." I nodded, unable to speak, the weight of grief like a stone crushing my chest. Then a sleek black car pulled up to the gate. Kennedy stepped out, elegant in a black dress, accompanied by a man in an expensive suit. I frowned, my heart racing. She hadn't told me she was coming, and her cold expression sent a chill through me. As the mourners stood in stunned silence, Kennedy approached me, the man trailing behind. "Emilio," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "We need to talk." She handed me a thick folder with a dark blue cover. I opened it, and the first words hit me like a blow. "Petition for divorce." Before I could react, she continued, her voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I can't keep living with a liar, Emilio. You used my family, used me for your own gain. I can't accept that." Her words were a razor slicing through my pride. My family, gathered quietly in the churchyard, turned to look. My mother, still wiping tears for my father, collapsed, her face pale. My Aunt Rosa, my mother's sister, shouted, "What are you saying, Kennedy? How dare you say that now?" Others murmured, their eyes filled with anger and pain. But Kennedy stood there, her gaze icy, as if oblivious to the cruel blow she'd just dealt my family. I looked at her, my eyes hollow from sleepless nights. I wanted to scream, to say that she and her family were the liars. I wanted to reveal the emails, the plans to seize the company, the plot to ruin me. But I didn't. I stood frozen, clutching the folder, feeling the world spin. I'd known this day would come. But I hadn't expected it to happen now at my father's funeral, when the pain of loss was already tearing me apart. My mother was helped inside by Aunt Rosa, her breathing faint. I wanted to run to her, to hold her and say everything would be okay. But I knew, in that moment, I couldn't afford to be weak. Kennedy had chosen the cruelest moment to strike, and I couldn't let her win. I met her eyes, my voice low but firm. "Are you done, Kennedy?" She flinched slightly but said nothing, turning and walking away, the lawyer following like a shadow. When her car disappeared, I went inside and knelt beside my mother, taking her hand. "I'm sorry, Mom," I whispered, tears finally spilling over. But in my heart, I knew this wasn't the time to cry. The pain of losing my father, Kennedy's betrayal, and the dark shadow of the Hayes family fused into a fire within me. I understood that everything was over. Love, trust, and a marriage built on lies. But I also knew this was the moment to fight back. Not with angry words or pointless arguments. I would fight with the truth, with the evidence I'd meticulously gathered over months. I stood, wiped my tears, and looked toward the church where my father rested. "Dad," I whispered in my heart, "I won't let you down." The days after my father's funeral, I returned to Seattle like a soldier coming back from a battlefield, carrying the weight of grief and a burning resolve. But before I could catch my breath, the Hayes family struck. Kennedy filed for divorce, and immediately, a vicious media campaign to smear me was launched with staggering speed. Local newspapers, online news sites, and even social media were flooded with cruel headlines. Immigrant engineer accused of tax fraud. Emilio Vargas, exploiter of a tycoon family for personal gain. Each word was a dagger, not only piercing my pride, but also the sacrifices my parents made to get me where I am today. Kennedy appeared on television, her eyes glistening like the perfect victim. In a widely broadcast interview, she recounted a tale of my betrayal, claiming I had exploited her trust and her family's wealth for personal gain. Her voice trembled, but I knew it was a meticulously staged performance. Public opinion swung heavily in her favor. Partners who once shook my hand and praised my products began pulling away. Calls stopped coming, emails were ignored, and I became an outcast in the eye of the storm. The office of Vargas and Hayes Innovations, once buzzing with ideas, now held only suspicious glances and whispered rumors. Each night I sat in the Queen Anne house, listening to the waves crash against Puget Sound, feeling like the world had turned its back on me. Beau, my little son, was the only light in those dark days. I held him close, whispering stories about his grandfather, his old guitar, and the songs he used to play. But even looking into Beau's innocent eyes, I couldn't shake the pain. Kennedy didn't just want to take the company. She wanted to destroy my honor, to make me a failure in my son's eyes. But they underestimated me. I was no longer the trembling immigrant boy cowed by the Hayes family's pressure. I had prepared for this day, and now it was time to fight back. I didn't make a scene or rush to the press to defend myself. Instead, I contacted Maria, my lawyer in Los Angeles, and sent her all the evidence I'd gathered over months. International bank transfers, emails between Kennedy Donovan and the lawyer Caldwell, and recordings of internal calls obtained from my monitoring software. "Maria," I said through a secure channel, my voice firm, "it's time for the truth to speak." Maria worked swiftly. She collaborated with a digital forensics expert to authenticate every piece of evidence, ensuring each email and transaction had timestamps and was indisputable. Meanwhile, I stayed silent, letting the Hayes family believe they'd won. I knew any move now could make them wary, and I didn't want to lose my advantage. As Maria's team cross-referenced the data, they uncovered something I hadn't anticipated. Dozens of transactions from Vargas and Hayes Innovations had been funneled through intermediary companies, all linked to the Hayes Construction Group's financial network. These weren't just accounting errors, they were part of a sophisticated money laundering system Donovan Hayes had been running for years. Vargas and Hayes was merely a tech front used to legitimize illicit funds sent overseas. This discovery turned the divorce case from a civil dispute into a federal economic crime investigation, implicating not just Kennedy but her father's entire empire. A week later, Maria filed a countersuit in federal court, attaching all my evidence. The suit demanded the dismissal of the accusations against me and an investigation into the financial activities of Hayes Construction Group. My evidence, emails detailing the company takeover, international transfers to shell companies, and recordings of secret discussions, was presented clearly and irrefutably. The court promptly froze the assets of Hayes Construction Group and launched an official investigation involving the IRS and the Department of Justice. The event shook Seattle's financial world like an earthquake. Hayes Construction Group, once a symbol of power and wealth, became the center of a massive scandal. Major newspapers, which had once painted Kennedy as a victim, began to shift. Immigrant engineer exposes tycoon family's financial underworld, one headline read. Emilio Vargas, hero or betrayed? Another asked. Public opinion flipped so quickly it left me dizzy. People who had turned their backs on me started sending apology emails, and old partners called, eager to reconnect. But I didn't care about their words. I only wanted the truth to be revealed. The first court hearing was tense. I sat in the back with Maria, watching Kennedy and Donovan across the room. Kennedy didn't look at me, her eyes fixed on her clasped hands. Donovan, however, glared at me with a cold intensity, as if promising I'd pay. But I wasn't afraid. I'd come too far to back down. Maria stood, her voice ringing through the courtroom. She presented each piece of evidence, from emails outlining the company takeover to international money transfers. A recording played, Donovan's voice unmistakable. He'll never know. When it's done, Emilio will walk away with nothing and we'll have everything. Murmurs filled the room, and I saw Kennedy lower her head, her shoulders trembling. I didn't know what she felt. Regret, shame, or just fear of exposure. But I no longer cared. Maria continued, proving I was the victim of a carefully orchestrated plot. I hadn't committed tax fraud or embezzlement. I was the one who uncovered the Hayes family's money laundering scheme. The evidence, verified by digital forensics, left no room for rebuttal. When Maria finished, I felt a weight lift. For the first time in months, I could breathe without my chest feeling crushed. The hearing ended with the judge's order. The investigation would continue, and Hayes Construction Group's assets would remain frozen until a final ruling. As I left the courtroom, reporters swarmed, microphones thrust toward me. But I shook my head and walked away. I didn't want to be a hero in the headlines. I just wanted to reclaim what was mine. My honor, my company, and my son's future. That night, I sat in my study, looking out at Puget Sound. The moonlight still shimmered as it had on the nights I gathered evidence, but now I didn't feel alone. The truth was out, my honor restored, and the fight I'd doggedly pursued had shifted in my favor. I thought of my father, his words that honesty would keep me standing. And I knew whatever battles lay ahead, I had made him proud. The days following the first hearing shook Seattle with another earthquake, not in the ground, but in the financial world. One morning, as I was brewing coffee in the Queen Anne kitchen, my phone rang. Maria, my lawyer, spoke urgently. Emilio, turn on the TV. They're at Hayes Construction Group's headquarters. I rushed to the local news channel, and the site froze me. Economic Crime Unit officers and IRS agents in stern uniforms stormed the gleaming skyscraper of Hayes Construction Group. They carried out boxes of documents, sealing off offices, while the company's employees stood outside, their faces etched with confusion. The camera panned to Donovan Hayes, escorted out of the building, hands cuffed behind his back. He maintained a defiant posture, but his eyes no longer held their sharp edge. They were empty, as if he knew his empire was crumbling. The news relentlessly reported Donovan's indictment on multiple charges: money laundering, tax fraud, and establishing shell companies to conceal illegal funds. Kennedy, my wife, or rather my former wife, didn't escape justice's reach. She was under investigation as an accomplice. having signed off on fictitious contracts and shady transactions I'd uncovered through my monitoring software. Within days, the Hayes family's assets were frozen. Bank accounts, company shares, and lavish properties, from the Laurelhurst lakeside mansion to suburban resorts, were sealed. Multi-million-dollar construction projects at Hayes Construction Group ground to a halt, leaving hundreds of employees jobless. The media, which once hailed the Hayes family as a symbol of success, turned on them. "An empire falls to greed and deceit," one major newspaper headlined. "From pinnacle of power to abyss of scandal," another wrote. Images of Kennedy and Donovan, once glamorous in magazines, were replaced by courtroom photos, their faces dulled under the flash of reporters' cameras. I watched it all, not with the thrill of victory, but with a strange emptiness. The people who once scorned me, whispering that I was unworthy of Kennedy, now fell silent. The probing looks at high society parties, the mocking remarks about my background, all vanished as if they'd never existed. A few old acquaintances sent apology messages claiming they'd misunderstood me, but I didn't respond. I didn't need their validation. I needed only Bo, my mother, and the truth I'd fought to protect. I chose silence, refusing to retaliate or flaunt my victory in the media. Instead, I worked closely with the investigators. Every document, email, and recording I provided was a piece completing the puzzle of the Hayes family's conspiracy. I didn't do this out of hatred. I did it for my father, who taught me that justice doesn't need loud cries. It needs only the truth. Within weeks, the Hayes empire unraveled. The skyscraper of Hayes Construction Group, once a symbol of power, stood empty, marked only by sealed signs and memories of a faded glory. Kennedy vanished from the spotlight, no longer appearing on TV or at social events. Some sources claimed she'd left Seattle, seeking to escape the scrutiny and tightening investigations. Donovan, who once looked at me with disdain, now faced decades in prison. The Hayes family, once Seattle's kings and queens, was reduced to a shadow of itself. Meanwhile, I became an unwilling symbol. Newspapers called me the immigrant hero, the man who stood against a tycoon empire. A tech magazine even published a long feature on my journey from the San Diego slums to the Seattle courtroom. But I didn't feel like a hero. I was just a man who fought for what he believed in: honor, family, and truth. Each night I returned to the Queen Anne house, now just me and Bo. The house, still bearing the Hayes Construction Group name on its deed, was no longer my cage. I sat by Bo's bedside, watching him sleep, his soft curls so like my father's. "Son," I whispered, "I'll give you a life where you'll never feel ashamed." I thought of my mother, how she cried when she heard the Hayes empire had fallen. "You did the right thing, Emilio," she said, her voice full of pride. "Your father is smiling in heaven." I opened my laptop, checking emails from Maria. She reported that the investigation was ongoing, but my evidence was enough to ensure the Hayes family couldn't turn the tide. I closed the laptop, leaned back in my chair, and looked out at Puget Sound. The moonlight still shimmered, but it no longer evoked loneliness. It was the light of hope, of a future I knew I could rebuild. Not from money or power, but from honesty and resolve. I thought of my father, of the old guitar he left behind in our San Diego home. I promised myself that one day I'd teach Bo to play, just as my father taught me. And I'd tell him the story of his grandfather, a man who never abandoned his belief in truth. My fight wasn't over. There were still hearings, unanswered questions, but I knew, with each step, I was closer to freedom, to a life where I could hold my head high without fear of scorn. The months that followed were a grueling stretch of tension and waiting. I spent most of my time working with Maria and the investigators, providing additional details from my encrypted hard drive. Each court hearing was a battle, not just for justice, but for Bo's future. I didn't want him to grow up under the shadow of lies or the accusations the Hayes family had pinned on me. Every time I stepped into the courtroom, I felt my father's gaze, as if he were there, reminding me that honesty is the strongest weapon. Finally, after months of litigation, the federal court delivered its final ruling. The judge, with a calm but clear voice, declared that I, Emilio Vargas, was the victim of a criminal conspiracy orchestrated by the Hayes family. All charges against me, tax fraud, embezzlement, were completely dismissed. Moreover, the court ordered that full ownership of Vargas and Hayes Innovations be restored to me, recognizing me as the founder and heart of the company. Hearing the verdict, I sat in silence, not out of joy, but from an overwhelming sense of relief, as if a ton of weight had been lifted from my chest. Kennedy faced the consequences of her actions. She was sentenced to 5 years of probation, stripped of custody rights, and ordered to pay substantial reparations for the damages she and her family caused. I didn't see her at the final hearing. She didn't show, perhaps unable to face the exposed truth. Donovan Hayes, the man who once looked at me with disdain, received an 18-year prison sentence for money laundering, tax fraud, and creating shell companies. As he was led out of the courtroom, I saw an old man no longer resembling the powerful chairman of Hayes Construction Group. His empire had crumbled entirely, leaving only a wreckage of greed and deceit. I left the courtroom, ignoring reporters' questions. I didn't want to be the center of attention. I just wanted to return to Bo, to my mother, and to the person I'd fought to remain. But before leaving Seattle, I faced a crucial decision about Vargas and Hayes Innovations. The company was once my dream, but now it carried too many painful memories. The days of being belittled, the sleepless nights of doubt, the betrayal of the woman I loved. I couldn't continue running it without feeling the shadow of the Hayes family. After many sleepless nights, I decided to sell most of my shares in the company. The proceeds allowed me to pay off my mother's debts, ensuring she could live comfortably in San Diego. I still remember the day I handed her the check. She looked at me, tears glistening. "You didn't have to do this, Emilio," she said, her voice trembling. "I just want you to be happy." I hugged her, whispering, "Mom, I'm happy knowing you don't have to worry anymore." With the remaining funds, I kept a small portion to start anew, not in Seattle, but where I truly belonged. I withdrew from the media and the world of big business. The flashing cameras, high society parties, and calculated handshakes were no longer my life. I returned to San Diego with Bo and a new, simpler dream. I wanted to raise my son with honesty and self-respect as my parents raised me. Each night I sat by Bo's side, reading to him, telling him about his grandfather, promising him a world not ruled by money or power. With the remaining funds from the sale, I founded a small tech company called Morales Digital, named after my father's true surname as a tribute. Morales Digital doesn't chase multi-million-dollar contracts or high society glamour. Instead, it focuses on digital solutions for small businesses. Street vendors, family shops, people like my parents who need a chance to rise. That was my original vision when I entered tech, and now I could live it. My life is no longer glamorous. I rent a modest house in San Diego near where I grew up, with a small garden where Bo can play. Each morning I take him to preschool, watching him wave with a radiant smile. I work at Morales Digital's small office with a handful of employees who share my dream. We don't compete with tech giants. We just want to provide practical solutions to help ordinary people build better lives. Every week I take Bo to visit my mother. She cooks us traditional Mexican meals, the scent of tacos and enchiladas filling her small kitchen. I sit there watching her and Bo laugh, feeling a peace I never had in Seattle. I'm no longer the successful immigrant engineer in the headlines. I'm just Emilio, a father, a son, and a man living true to his values. One afternoon, while cleaning the storage shed, I found my father's guitar. It was old, the strings worn, but when I touched it, I could almost hear his warm, loving voice. I brought it to the living room, placed it on a wooden stand, and promised myself I'd teach Bo to play someday. I want him to know that life isn't just about money or fame, but about the simple moments, the songs that come from the heart. Though my life lacks the old glamour, it's more meaningful than ever. I work on my terms, free from power or schemes. I am Emilio Vargas, son of Manuel and Rosa, father of Bo, and a man who chose the path of truth. And every time I look into my son's eyes, I know I chose right. Years have passed since those chaotic days in Seattle. I've left behind the spotlight, the glowing headlines, and the painful memories of the Hayes family. Now I live in San Diego in a modest house with a garden full of flowers where Bo can run and laugh. Morales Digital, the company bearing my father's true surname, runs steadily, serving small businesses with simple yet effective tech solutions. I no longer dream of multi-million-dollar contracts or fame. I just want to bring a bit of light to people like my parents, ordinary workers struggling to survive in an unfair world. One early autumn morning, with San Diego's air cool and gentle sunlight filtering through the trees, I took Bo's hand and walked with him to the cemetery where my father rests. Bo, now 7, skipped ahead, his curly hair bouncing in the breeze. He carried a bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked from our garden, saying, "Grandpa likes simple things." I smiled, warmed by my son's innocence, but a wave of emotion surged as we stopped before the gravestone. The stone bore my father's name, Manuel Vargas, simple yet dignified. I knelt, placing my hand on its cool surface, feeling as if I were touching memories of him. The strum of his guitar in our old house, his warm voice telling stories, his trusting eyes when he said, "Honesty will keep you standing, Emilio." Bo stood beside me, placing the flowers at the grave, then looked up. "Dad, does Grandpa know you won?" he asked, his voice clear and bright. I smiled, ruffling his hair. "He knows, son. He always does." Then I began telling Bo about my journey, not as a hero's tale, but as the story of an immigrant boy once scorned, pushed into a corner, yet who chose to stand up for his honor. I spoke of the tough days in San Diego's working-class neighborhood, the sleepless nights coding, and how I fought to hold on to the truth, even at the cost of a broken marriage and scars that would never fully heal. Standing before my father's grave, I reflected on my journey. I was once a poor boy in a rundown house where my mother scrubbed floors until her hands bled and my father played music for spare change. I was a young engineer with big dreams to change the world through technology, and I was a husband who believed love could overcome any barrier. But above all, I am Emilio Vargas, a man who learned that truth, though it may be buried for a time, always finds a way to rise. The losses, betrayals, and pain I endured didn't break me. They taught me the value of freedom and dignity. Money can buy mansions, cars, or power, but it cannot buy self-respect. The Hayes family, with all their wealth and influence, fell to their greed and deceit. And I, though no longer bathed in glamour, stand here, head held high, with a simple but fulfilling life. I looked at Bo, twirling a fallen leaf between his small fingers. I took his hand, feeling its warmth, and a message stirred in my heart, not just for my son, but for anyone who's felt the world turn its back on them. Money may bring power, but truth brings freedom. Don't let gratitude become chains. Hold on to your dignity, for it's the one thing money can't buy. I knelt beside Bo, pointing to my father's gravestone. "Son," I said softly but firmly, "Grandpa once told me, when you live right, time will stand by you." Bo nodded, perhaps not fully grasping the word's weight. But I knew one day he would. I would teach him to live as my father did, as I've tried to live, with honesty and resolve, no matter how harsh the world may be. A gentle breeze swept through the trees, carrying the scent of grass and earth. I stood, holding Bo's hand, and we walked out of the cemetery. The autumn sun lit the path ahead, as if opening a new chapter of life. I was no longer the successful immigrant engineer or the hero who exposed a tycoon empire. I was just Emilio, a father, a son, and a man who had found the true meaning of his life. Back home, Bo ran into the garden, chasing a butterfly. I stood on the porch watching him and smiled. My journey, with all its pain and triumphs, had led me here, a place where justice, honesty, and love still held value. I closed my eyes, feeling the cool breeze, and in my heart, I heard my father's voice. "You did well, Emilio." And I knew somewhere among the stars he was smiling.